Jean Dufresne is a history professor who loves to drive his historic MGB.
He has a passion for the past, for any objects that has something to tell.
Wayne Suffolk's 1940 McLaughlin Buick Special is frozen in time.
You know, back in those days, I think the car was the most cherished member of the family.
Cool cars, good people, great car stories. John and Anne Dufresne have loved MGs ever since they first fell in love with each other.
When Jean and I, started to be together, we had access to an MG Midget, which was Jean's mom car. And so we went along, driving down the streets in Quebec City and very stylishly. And we basically have this tie between the beginning of our love story and the fact that this car symbolizes it.
Anne is my true love. It's thanks to her that we have been able to achieve what we have achieved. And that means family, personal interests, and in my case, also the little car.
John and Anne live in the Western Canadian prairies, where British sports cars are extremely rare.
When you live in the middle of the prairies, to have the luck of finding such a car, that's what it is, a sheer luck.
It was owned by a mechanic, and it was advertised in the paper, so I was able to locate it and go and have a look.
So he was really excited when he finally made sure about the history of the car and was able to actually acquire the car.
Hands are marvelous things. They can put together something as rugged and reliable as a front disc brake, or as precise as a carburetor. There are over 1,000 pairs of hands at Abingdon, England. Together, they build the MGB. MG, the sports car America loved first.
The reason MG went into small sports cars and convertibles after World War II, I think, was mostly for exportation. Selling in the United States brought US dollars to England, and England needed the money. So they really opened up that market.
My husband is actually a historian by trade. He went to university as a historian, and so he has a passion for the past, for any objects that has something to tell.
The MGB was kind of the ultimate expression of the British sports car before the British sports car industry went into a state of terminal decline. Standards set by the MGB was met and maybe surpassed by some subsequent cars, but it was the MGB that they were measuring themselves against.
His lower profile, his elongated front piece that makes it looking like a racing car, and even the black bumpers.
In 1974, North American safety regulations forced MG to replace chrome bumpers with black plastic ones.
I thought the bumper on an MGB was supposed to be chrome.
Because the Americans were saying for safety protections that in case of a 5 miles an hour impact, the headlights have to survive. And the chrome bumpers, you were not able to do anything. At 5 miles an hour, the whole front would be damaged. When those bumpers came out, there was a bit of how can I say, hesitation. You know, the public wasn't sure if that was correct or not. I think it aged well. It's not unusual now to see plastic bumpers. Usually they're painted the same color as the car, but the contrast is nice. You know, it's a good compromise.
North American regulators also gave MGs a third windshield wiper.
If you look at this car, you can tell it was designed for exportation. The 3 wipers are the first thing you'll notice. In England, they kept 2 wipers until the very end, 1980. And the side lights are also a telltale for an American car.
MGs took another hit when they were faced with new air pollution rules.
By the late 70s, especially after 1975, emission controls were getting so restrictive that the engines couldn't really breathe.
The British motor industry was in a serious state of decline by the late 60s and early 70s. There wasn't enough money to develop new products. If they developed new products, they weren't very good. And if they were a decent design, they were extremely badly executed. MGB was caught right up in the middle of this, and as a result, they just got more and more antiquated.
It's a 1.8. It's the old British technology from the 50s. Cars get better and better all the time. The British cars were getting worse, which is a sad story, because in the 60s, that setup would have been great in an MGB. So I had to make a compromise and get rid of some original equipment to install a better carburetor and an exhaust manifold that makes the engine more fuel efficient and performing better, which is kind of a nice thing to have.
The MGB has a basic motor, but John prefers it that way.
The engine of the MGB was almost old when the car was new in 1979. But at the same time, I would say it's almost an asset, because simplicity today makes fixing the engine, working on it, a lot simpler for someone like me, for an owner that has some knowledge but is not a full-time mechanic.
It's really, really practical to have a guy that knows his way around cars.
The Dufresnes built a garage for Jean's MG and a studio for Anne's art.
My wife has a great studio, and she's able to work on her art. And I have the garage, which is where I like to be and work on my MG.
We ended up deciding that we were going to do an addition to our little bungalow, so the studio could be in that area, and he could have a garage that was better suited for his needs.
In a way, it's a great relationship, because we both have our personal interests and a space to enjoy those interests, but we also both connect with each other's interests, which is, I think, the best way possible.
After the break, Jean learns a lesson.
The kids basically told him, "You are never going to get rid of the MGB."
Wayne Suffolk's McLaughlin Buick has been in his family since the day his grandpa and Uncle Charlie brought it home.
In September of 1939, my grandfather and my uncle went to a car show in Regina. My grandfather ordered the car, but never received it until November of 1939 because the car had to be built.
This car was assembled in Regina, Saskatchewan, in a General Motors assembly plant, the only assembly plant of any of the big three that was ever located in Western Canada.
When the Second World War broke out, the Buick factory was converted to munitions production, and McLaughlin Buick stopped rolling off the line.
Now an ammunition factory, one of hundreds engaged in turning out the millions of rounds of small arms ammunition needed by the United Nations.
Wayne's McLaughlin Buick is a rare example of a car built just before the Second World War stopped production.
This is a 1940 automobile. There were no automobiles built for the next 4 or 5 years. That's why most of the cars from the 30s have disappeared, because they all got used up while there was no supply to replace them.
This car is all original. The paint is original, and it was a color called Rocky Mountain Brown that was only on Canadian cars. And the interior is what they call Bedford cord.
This dashboard is amazing.
When you look at it, the dash is all hand-painted wood grain, brushed aluminum on the glove box and around the speedometers. And you look at the gauges, how beautiful they are.
Cars today, you don't see that.
In the middle of the dashboard is one incredibly low number.
This car, through some very interesting circumstances, has a very, very low mileage on it.
It now has 40,000 miles on it. I put about 2,000 miles on the car. But that's the most unique thing about this car is it's all original and it's low miles.
The car was never driven because its second owner couldn't see.
My uncle was blind all of his life. And when my grandfather passed away, Charlie ended up with the Buick. My Uncle Charlie was the most amazing man I've ever met. Even though he was totally blind all of his life, and when I say totally blind, he couldn't tell you if the light was on or off. He was an electrician by trade.
Here's a guy that grew up during the Depression. I mean, a time in in history that was challenging for able-bodied people to grow up in. He grew up completely blind. And some of the talents that he had, you know, they rival some of the most able-bodied people I've ever met. He was intelligent, he was innovative, he was an inventor.
For years, the Buick was a prized possession of the Suffolk family.
Back in those days, it seems like every family photo had a picture of their car in it, and in this case, the Buick was no different. I've got pictures of when the car was brand new with Charlie's youngest brother sitting on the front bumper. I've got pictures of his other brother when he got married standing beside it, my grandparents. You know, back in those days, I think the car was the most cherished member of the family. That's why it was in all the family photos.
This car is a really good example of what a premium level family car looked like in the late 1930s.
When Charlie inherited the Buick from Wayne's grandpa, he put it away.
Charlie kept that car hidden in his garage.
I recall, you know, going over to my Uncle Charlie's house when I was young, probably, you know, 8 or 9 years old, and you would go into his garage and he had mountains of things that he collected throughout the years, and in the middle of this pile was this pristine 1940 Buick. And it was always an adventure because we would climb over these piles and we'd sit in it. But it was always made very clear that we had to be really careful not to disturb anything because with my Uncle Charlie being blind, that's the only way he could navigate or find things.
The car is in such great condition, but why haven't you fixed the fenders?
Those cars in those days were built more or less for straight line, and trying to parallel park one of those things is like trying to parallel park a school bus with no power steering. And you have to remember, my grandfather drove it till he was 90 years old, so I think he bumped into a few things on the way. In 1974, I said to my uncle, I'll fix the dents and the fenders on the Buick for you, and then you can put it in the World of Wheels. And he said no. It was a flat out no. And this caught me by surprise because I thought, you know, part of owning a classic car is showing it off to people and seeing other classic cars. So I said to him, well, why not? And he says, well, if I put it in a car show, I won't know where it's at, and I'm going to worry about it. And when you fix the dents and paint it, it's not original anymore. That told me that this was more than a car to him. The best memories of his life were in that car. And if that car was safe, his memories were safe.
When Uncle Charlie died in 2012, Wayne dug the old car out.
Well, it had been inside his garage for 40 years, under a foot of dust, stuff piled up around it. The car was in great shape. It just needed to be brought back to life. You know, I needed to put fresh fuel in it. I steamed out the gas tank, blew up the tires, and it fired right up.
Up next, a McLaughlin Buick rolls for royalty.
My granddaughter sits in the back, feels like she's the queen.